Hi, Julie.
Hi, Desi.
How are we on audio back there, people? Too much? Not enough.
Thanks for having us, Portland Public Library and Desi. It's really, I should just say, by way of full disclosure before we begin, that generally the conversations Desi and I have been conducted on the beach in Blue Hill or Brooklyn, Maine. And so this is actually just going to be a continuation of a conversation that's been going on for a long time, but is generally carried out in bathing suits and like ripped shorts. So.
It's hard for us to recognize each other wearing shoes and a normal person clothing.
But we're going to try.
We're going to try. We're going to try to keep it all together. Thank you guys for coming out. Thanks for sharing Thursday night with us. I have been a fan of Julie's work since I read The Invisible Bridge 10 years ago, and have had the distinct honor of getting to spend my last year fully in the world of that book as I've been working on this pilot adaptation. So, though I'm not technically a scholar of any official repute, I do feel like an expert on at least, I used to feel like an expert on just one, but now I have deeply gone into the world of a flight portfolio as well. When Julie sent me the ARC of the book in December, it's not like I didn't have faith in you, but I was like, well, it's not like she's going to do it again. But then again, there's that magic trick that one of the things that I love best about Julie's writing is this sort of miracle of being able to hold in focus at the same time the epic storytelling, the sort of grand sweeping scale, at the same time having these very intimate character details and dynamics. And like all great fiction, it fires on an intellectual and an emotional level. And the flight portfolio was in a different, slightly different time period-ish, or more contained 1940, but still was able to pull off everything that you did in The Invisible Bridge and more, with a very deep psychological look at a person while also being a white-knuckling, swashbuckling, cloak and dagger, very exciting read.
Thanks, Desi.
So I first wanted to talk to you, or assuming that not everyone has read the book yet, can you just level the playing field and tell people in the audience just a little bit about who Aryan Frey was, if he's not a household name?
Okay. I'm just going to unclip the mic because I feel like it's preventing me from actually seeing you and talking to. Can you still hear me okay? Thanks. Aryan Frey was a New York journalist who went to Marseille in 1940 when he was about 35 years old to try to locate and arrange emigrations for writers and artists who've been blacklisted by the Gestapo. He went as the representative of this group called the Emergency Rescue Committee, which actually still exists, now called the International Rescue Committee, and you should all look it up online and donate to it. And the group, he had formed the group with some like-minded Americans in New York the previous summer, with a thought in mind that they could identify and find and somehow lift out of the horrific situation of Europe at that time and bring them to the United States these incredible artists who had been doing work that basically caused them to run afoul of their fascist governments. He'd never done any work before like this at all. He was just, he was the editor of a magazine that specialized in foreign affairs, and then he headed an imprint at a publishing house, and he published work that had to do with the political situation abroad. So he had a lot of knowledge of what was going on, and he had a lot of foresight, which I think allowed him to proceed, to know how important it was to proceed with alacrity in this situation. But he'd never done any kind of relief work. He'd never arranged immigrations, legal or illegal. He didn't know what kind of papers were necessary. He didn't know what the sort of machine was like that helped or prevented people from getting out of France. So he basically had to figure out all this stuff on the ground while he was, in the process of alienating both his own organization and the French government, because he very quickly realized that the only way to get his work done was to go outside the law. And so his goal was to arrange emigration for the 200 writers and artists who had been on his list, and he managed to get more than 2,000 people out with the help of some really adept associates and one important ally in the U.S. Visa Office.
And for Aryan Frey, am I right to say that it was maybe 5 years before his post that he took in 1940, that you said that he actually was in Germany in 1935 or something, or in Berlin, and saw something, a riot or something, that he was actually one of the first people to write in the New York Times about what he was seeing happening
on the ground.
On the ground, right? And so for him, I think, were the stakes, he understood the stakes.
Yeah, so after he graduated college, he went to Harvard, and he graduated in 1931. He moved to New York, and a few years later, he was offered the editorship of this magazine called The Living Age that was essentially about foreign policy, politics, and essentially what was going on in Europe at that time. And in order to assume this editorship, the editorial board required that he go to Germany for a period of 4 months and actually see for himself what was transpiring there. So he went, and he traveled all around the country. He spent time in the small towns and in the suburbs and in the cities. And on his last night in town, he witnessed a horrific riot on the Kurfürstendamm and saw all sorts of violence carried out against Jewish Germans. But the interesting thing about that was that that wasn't the only thing he was writing about for the Times. He also was meeting with members of Hitler's government who were telling him in great detail about their plans. And so he was actually writing about the Nazis' plans for the rest of Europe at the time, and everyone in the States was incredulous. I mean, literally incredulous. They just didn't believe that what they were hearing could possibly be correct because it was so outsized and outrageous.
Well, tell us, when you were in the research phase for Invisible Bridge, I think you told me once that it was in that process of researching that novel that you came across the story of Aryan Frey. And I'd be interested to hear, at what point, or basically how deep did you have to go into the sort of, his external, like the events of his life were really fascinating. And so it's clear, I can imagine reading that and saying, wow, there's a story in this. But how deep did you have to sort of go into the psyche or the psychology that made him so interesting that you realized that you needed to sort of break it off and that it wasn't worth being or relegated to a footnote in Invisible Bridge, but a meal of its own right?
Yeah, well, it's true. The way you characterize it is accurate, that it wasn't a novel that I set out to write. It was a novel that I accidentally happened upon. I was researching the Franco-German armistice, and there was this clause of the Franco-German armistice called the Surrender on Demand Clause, where basically Germany could extradite any current or former German national at will for trial in Germany for any trumped-up charge they chose. And when I Googled that phrase, surrender on demand, up came this memoir by Aryan Frey. And I'd never heard this guy's name before. I'd never heard of his story before. And as soon as I started to realize the impact he'd had on 20th century art, I thought, oh my God, this is incredible. I need to write about this person in some form. And then it wasn't until maybe a couple months later, as I started reading some of his letters, which were collected in this great compendium that had been published by Columbia, which holds the whole archive of his work, I started to realize that, first of all, he'd had kind of an unusual trajectory. While he was at Harvard, he had started this avant-garde literary magazine with Lincoln Kirstein, the future impresario of the New York City Ballet, who was also his lover at the time. And then I started reading about what it was like to be gay at Harvard in the 20s, and how it must have felt for these guys who were coming in after an aggressive and horrific inquiry into homosexuality at Harvard in the early 20s to then be living these lives that were very much outside the pale, but that had to be sort of institutionally accepted because it was too, Harvard felt like it was too great a shame to take on to actually call out the homosexuality in its ranks. And then I understood that while he was in Marseille, Varian had a relationship with Stéphane Hassel, who was the future French diplomat whose writings gave rise to the Occupy movement. And what was really interesting was that as I started to look into his biographies, and I started to read more deeply about him, any mention of his possibly having been gay was sort of submarined. It was just sort of buried, or it was excused. It was like this was a mistake he made in his younger years. And there was nobody who was really suggesting that the fact that he had been gay and closeted for all of his life before his time in Marseille might have sensitized him to the plight of others who were persecuted. And even though I knew that there wasn't a kind of one-to-one connection between those two things, it seemed to me a compelling enough part of his character that I just felt like there was so much beneath the surface. There were so many stories that hadn't been told about his life that could be told in a novel. And that really could only be told in a novel because they probably had not been captured in the history books. And in fact, they hadn't been.
That seems like you went pretty far.
Well, I did. I did. You know, I realized, I knew by then that it took, you know, it would be a matter of 5 to 7 years writing a novel, because that was about how long it had taken me to write the previous book. The previous 2 books, actually, even that short story collection that's only like 220 pages long, also took like 7 years to write. And so I guess I felt like I had to know him pretty well and be able to envision the story I was going to tell pretty deeply before I could know that that was the project I wanted to go to next.
Did you actually try to incorporate him into Invisible Bridge? Was there a moment where you thought, this actually makes sense to put in, and then you thought, no, I'm going to pry him out, or it...
No, because by the time I learned about him, in the green room, Desi and I were talking a little bit about this previous novel, Invisible Bridge, and what I told Desi was that it took me about 5 years to write a draft of that book. And when I read back over the draft and realized how much revision there was, it basically like had a nervous breakdown. I went for a walk where I was just weeping publicly. People were looking at me like, what's wrong with that poor woman? Something horrible must have just happened to her. Not thinking she just read the draft of her own novel. And so I knew by that time that I had to cut hundreds and hundreds of pages out of that draft. So I knew that there was no room for this other story, because even when I first heard about him, I thought, oh my God, this is hundreds of pages. You know, it was fascinating to the tune of hundreds of pages. But I just thought it would be too weird to write yet another book that took place in World War II. That wasn't really where I planned to live for like 18 years of my writing life, you know. But here we are.
I think it was Mae West who said, anything worth doing is worth doing slowly. So
yeah, okay. Yeah.
All right, I was wondering if you would be a dear and do a little reading for me. There's a page that we have discussed at a previously undisclosed location. I think it's on page 186. And this is an introduction. Or do you want to just talk a little bit about what Villa Herbel is in terms of a location? You want to talk about it after you describe it?
Yeah, let me set it up. So Aryan Frey, when he first started to undertake his mission in Marseille, he started a sort of independent, not an independent organization, but he started a sort of legit organization that he called the Centre Américain des Secours. So he was just providing aid to refugees, and he ran it out of his hotel room. So his hotel room was basically the size of this carpet on stage, and he had hundreds of people showing up every day hoping for some kind of aid, even if it was a little bit of money, or if it was some visa help, or if it was false papers, or just an introduction to somebody.
And lining up,
help.
Right? Like lining up outside.
Lining up in the hall. He had to, yes, he had that hotel well bribed to not just call up the police every single day and get everybody hauled down to the prefecture. And so eventually he moved the offices out of his hotel room and to an office space nearby. But he still had the problem of where to hide his most sensitive refugees. And he also had the problem of people showing up at his place at all hours demanding help and really needing help. And so a friend of his came across a house that was for rent in the countryside, about half an hour out of town, on a tram line, so it was easy to get to town. And it was big enough that he could house some of his more sensitive clients there, and also that he could live there with some of his staff too, so that the work didn't necessarily have to end at a certain time of the evening, but they could continue the more sensitive work
because even though he had diplomatic immunity, sort of, he was still in trouble with the Vichy government there, because they frowned upon his activities, even though he was American, so in some ways untouchable. So it was still better to be doing things not en plein air.
Yeah, and they made it clear to him that he was not really untouchable, that they could sort of step aside and turn him over to the Germans at any point. And he had run afoul of the US government fairly early on in his work, and so the degree of immunity he had was fairly limited. So he also felt like he had to have a place where he could be a little safer too, even though the police were always keeping tabs on him. So this friend of his, Mary Jane Gold, found this fantastic villa half an hour outside of town that had these maze-like gardens, and, well, I'll read to you a little bit about it. But it ended up becoming a kind of gathering place, not only for the surrealist artists and writers who he housed there, but for all the surrealists who were living in the vicinity. And so they would have these incredible parties there, and they would have exhibitions of the surrealists' work, and they would have these fundraisers, and they would have games that went on late into the night. And it became this kind of social hotbed in the midst of a kind of an ongoing tragedy, which I found so complicated in so many ways. But I'm going to read to you a little bit about Herbel. The house was exactly as Mary Jane had built it. They all met there the next morning. This is a scene where they're going to go and check out the house to see what it's like, to see if that's a place where they can envision living.
Well, because in the story, Varian is really not that interested. It seems too profligate to rent a villa outside the city, right? It's just too much. So, but Mary Jane is saying, you know what, let's just check it out, because she's seen it first, right?
And she's also saying she's going to fund it. She was one of the main donors to his organization. So she says, let's just go look at it. So Varian and some friends go and take a look at it. The house was exactly as Mary Jane had built it. They all build, B-I-L-L-E-D. It's one of those things where when you read it aloud, I was like, well, she didn't build it. As she had built it. As it appeared on the Mary Jane marquee the night before. Okay.
As built.
They all met there the next morning, Grant with his suitcase in hand, Varian with a terrible hangover, Mary Jane and Miriam in crisp fall tweeds, Killer, this is Mary Jane's boyfriend, having acquired a black eye. At the head of the long driveway stood a pair of flaking stone pillars, one of them inset with a brass sign that read Villa Herbel. On the other, a hand-painted wooden sign, for rent, inquire within. They climbed the drive until they cleared a little ridge. Below lay the beginning of the valley's slope. The air in the Val d'Ivonne was a gold-blue haze, sun filtering through shattered clouds to strike the scrublands below. It smelled of sage and lavender, of the chamomile that crowded the verge of the drive. Overhead, plane trees made an arch of broken shade. Half hidden by a gentle rise was the villa itself, of buff-colored stucco. Beneath their feet, the dirt road changed to close-set stones, and they passed the low carriage house that served as the caretaker's home. The inner gate was unlocked, and Mary Jane pushed it open with a proprietary gesture. They crossed the stone driveway and stood looking down into the garden, where an old man in a feather-decked Homburg dug with his spade. A four-lobed fountain splashed at the center of the garden, and overgrown paths snaked through the tall grass in all directions. Monsieur Touman, Mary Jane called. Here are the gentlemen. The old man looked up, wiped his brow with a smudged handkerchief, and rested a foot on the shovel. I can't understand a word you're saying, he called in French. They descended the stone stairs to the garden. Monsieur Touman brushed dust from his lapels and drew himself up straight. He was twig-like, small, his hands crabbed with arthritis, in his gaze a mild confusion at odds with attention and engagement. "Oh, gentlemen, I'm so glad you've come," he said. "Mademoiselle Gold thought you would like the house." "Will you show it to us?" Varian asked, and Monsieur Turman did. First the garden, its fountain big enough to wade in, and a stone-rimmed irrigation reservoir wide and deep as a swimming pool. There were wild flower beds, tangles of fruiting vines, a kitchen plot dense with late squashes and tomatoes. Beside the house was a glass-walled conservatory crowded with miniature palms and lemon trees. The house itself stood 3 stories tall, its back windows staring into the valley. They followed Turman through a terracotta-floored kitchen that might have been the twin of the one at the medieval pile, then into a dining room with a massive walnut table, each of its 12 chairs densely carved with leaf-like curlicues and slit-eyed elves. A trompe-l'oeil forest grew on the surrounding walls. Beyond was a salon with satin-covered sofas, then a library bristling with books in French and English and Latin. On a wall plaque above the mantel, a pair of hawkless hawk wings lifted in mid-beat, and on the marble shelf beneath, a tiny glass dome housed a perfectly preserved mole, small as a pear, seeming to sniff the air with its crushed flower of a nose. A shelf opposite held a mounted branch on which 5 stuffed finches perched, one of them in the act of catching an iridescent beetle. Surrealists, Varian thought, would appreciate the place.
Thank you. It was, there were so many different places that I could have asked you to read from, but one of the reasons that I just plucked that, besides I love setting up the Villa Herbel, the whole sort of conceit of this writers, thinkers, surrealist artists, colony that basically came together ad hoc there in the Marseille countryside, is that one of the things that I think is so extraordinary about the way that you write generally is how you immerse your reader into sense of place, and how, if things don't work out for you as a writer, you could definitely be like a super taster or a nose or something like that. Like, there's so much olfactory, sensory, there's so much in the book overall. The visuals, the sounds, the smells, the taste. I want to know what for you is your kind of alchemy to transport people, and are you going to Villa Herbel and taking notes? Are you reading firsthand accounts? How do you put it all together, and how do you transport people?
Well, what's weird is that you just don't have any recollection really of of all of the elements, I think, that go into describing a place, like how they came to you in the first place. Villa Herbel, sadly, does not exist anymore. I believe it was raised sometime in the mid-'80s. So when I went to Marseille, which I did when I was about 24 weeks pregnant with my son, who's now 9, I went out to La Pomme, the suburb where Herbel is located, looking for it. And of course, I knew that it wasn't there, but I was just sort of looking for the signs of it. I wanted to just walk the roads around there. I took so many pictures of the plants, because there were a lot of plants. There were a lot of Mediterranean plants that I had never seen before and whose names I didn't know. But I knew that, that somebody who was living there, especially who was as attuned to detail as Varian was, would have noticed all that stuff. But was another thing that I just realized as I was reading that excerpt?
What?
We just finished reading The Hobbit with Jacob and Lil, my 9 and 5-year-old, and that scene in The Hobbit where Bilbo and all the dwarves show up at Bjorn's house. Bjorn is this character, this incredible character in The Hobbit who transforms into a bear, but he's also this giant. Well, they go in, and it's like the first time they've had a square meal in months. And they're just hungry beyond words. And they go and they sit down around his table. And
It's
I
the
feel
same
like it's
exact
the same
thing
table.
that he wrote.
I feel like
It's all the surrealist dinners. They had the same thing.
that would have been a
He ripped
surrealist
you
dinner.
off?
No, I think that the way those chairs are described with elves carved into them, I feel like that is from
Subconsciously, you
I
lifted
feel like
that.
from when I read The Hobbit when I was 12, So the real answer to the question is I have no idea where all that stuff came from. I would not have thought of that if I hadn't just reread The Hobbit with Jacob and Lil. And then when you finish a draft of the book and have the nervous breakdown and everything, then you give it to friends to read so they can have a nervous breakdown on your behalf and feel terrible for you, maybe give you some advice. And one of my readers who is a dance writer for the New York Times, teased me mercilessly about the Invisible Bridge because there was so much food in it. Like, he was like, there really doesn't have to be a description of food every other page in this book. It takes place largely during the Second World War. Like, yes, food was a problem, but it doesn't have to be a problem on every other page. And then part of it takes place in Paris, and of course it doesn't have to be a delight every page that's in Paris. Well, here too, the same reader just rolled his eyes at me and was like, the food again, really? And yeah, I took out a lot of food. I know, it's France. I know.
But it was also France during famine, or not famine, but
yes.
there were restrictions, so I felt
that was part of it. That was part of it. When I was reading Varian's memoir, one of the things he kept mentioning was how hungry he was, and how hungry they all were because the food had disappeared. The French government was required to give, like, I think 70% of their agricultural output to the Nazis.
A couple of years ago, I just did the experiment for kicks. I went back and I read my journals, diaries, or whatever from my year in Paris, just looking for some anecdotes. There are no anecdotes. There's only descriptions of food.
Yeah,
You
well,
know,
that's why
I don't know what I
that's
did,
why
but
we're
I know
here together, Desi.
but I know what I
always had
ate.
this connection. I mean, I think what it really comes down to is thinking about, or what has guided me in sort of describing places and thinking about what to put on the page is what people would have noticed, that the people who are there, what would they have been paying attention to? Not what we would notice from our perspective, but because Varian's work, which he had sort of undertaken for ideological reasons, began to tell upon his body as he didn't have enough to eat, and he started to, he already had gastrointestinal problems, and it just started to become worse and worse because of the scarcity and the low quality of the food he had. And I just thought, what would that have been like to realize that this political project that you've undertaken is going to tell upon your body maybe forever, And that was happening all over. I wrote this little tiny story, this tiny short story last spring for Tea Magazine about Audrey Hepburn and how during the war she subsisted for a time on tulip bulbs and how that changed her physiology forever and just made it difficult for her she didn't develop properly because it happened at, this essentially key time in her growth. And
well, especially, and if there's scarcity, then when you do have a meal, you're going to be savoring it. And so that's the sort of stuff that, when the chef at Villa Herbel finds, forages and finds mushrooms or something, then it's going to be celebrated. And therefore, from his perspective, if you're channeling from him, then you're going to make the effort to describe it. Anyway, it is one of your superpowers, in case you didn't know it.
Desi.
I've one other, just following up on that question about just sort of research methodology. I know from Invisible Bridge as well, you have to go, it's not like you were a history scholar at Cornell. I think you didn't take a single class, right, in history, which is amazing.
I placed out of it. I took AP history in high school, so I placed out of history at Cornell. So if any of you have high school students and they're taking AP history, please tell them this does not mean you should not take history in college.
Or it just means you have to be an autodidact and spend 5 years researching books or whatever. But I wondered, in terms of your process, do you gather, and sort of build up a gigantic arsenal so you feel like, okay, I've got a grasp on this, and then I'm going to start writing? Or do you feel like you're too impatient to start with, to begin writing, that you start and then fill in the blanks as it goes?
Well, it was kind of a combination with this book. I foolishly thought, well, because I've just spent 7 years writing a book that takes place in World War II, France mainly, and Hungary. I know a good deal about World War II. That was true to a limited extent, but what was so different about writing this book was that it proceeded from the life and the doings of a real person, a person whose life had been extensively documented, not only in his own memoir and in the numerous biographies that had been published, but in a 19-box archive at Columbia, where his letters to all of his associates, his letters to his parents, to his wife, all of his papers from Marseille, his cocktail napkin jottings, his plane tickets, all the photographs he took, just boxes and boxes and boxes of stuff, existed for the looking. And I went a few years into the writing of this book to look at that archive, and I just thought, oh my God, this is a 20-year project. I also knew that there were others who were conducting research on Aryan Frey who had in fact been researching him for 20 years, been working on projects for 20 years. And I thought, I need to write a finite novel, and so...
Get into those 19 boxes? Did you spend a couple weeks, a couple years?
I teach at Columbia, not every semester, but occasionally, like maybe once a year or once every couple of years. And every time I taught at Columbia over the course of 7 years, I would spend at least one day a week just in the archive, just sitting in the archive. Whenever I had another excuse to be up there, I would just sit in the archive all day and just go through the boxes for hours and hours. So there was a long process of revving up to actually being able to write, to put words to paper in a kind of continuous way. I would say that it took about, I'm going to say horrifying, a number that's going to horrify myself. It took about 3 years before I could really start committing words to paper, 4 years before I was really actively writing the book. And I really didn't think that was going to be the case because I felt like I had studied. I mean, when I was teaching at Michigan, I actually took undergraduate courses in European history just to learn more. So I would love to think of myself as fully an autodidact when it comes to this history, but I wasn't. I had some very good guidance from a number of quarters. But I really did have to learn for years before I could even start to write this book.
Well, it reflects, it shows, and I feel like probably most of what I know about World War II now comes at your hands, so thank you.
Oh man, okay.
All right, so following up that, I want to quote yourself to yourself, if that's all right. So in 2013, when you were a Radcliffe Fellow, which was a research fellowship, because you were there at Harvard going through his files, which had just been unlocked, right? Like in a cinematic moment of timing, like Julie shows up and they're like, oh, these files, which have been locked for 80 years, right? All of a sudden were made public.
Yeah, his student files had just been sort of released for public research.
Right, so Julie could actually see his application to Harvard and stuff like that. So there is a talk that Julie gave when she was a fellow at Radcliffe in 2013, which I assume was still in the deep research phase, right? Probably not writing yet. And you spoke, it was called Lies That Tell the Truth. And it was sort of, in some ways it wasn't a defense of historical fiction, but it was certainly an exploration of the what makes it powerful, what makes it tricky, and what are the capabilities of historical fiction. And by the way, the talk is available still on YouTube. You could stream it right now if you wanted to have Julie in stereo, but you can look it up. And it's
one pregnant version of me and one not pregnant version.
Right. And so you make the point that at that point, by 2013, there's already been, Frey's autobiography or memoir, Surrender on Demand, numerous biographies, the made-for-TV movie starring William Hurt. Right? And so you asked yourself the question, why the novel? Why the novel? And here is what you said. I guess I've been interested for a long time in the ways writers interlace real and fictional events, how we study and transform the past for the purposes of writing stories and novels, and how the tension between history, speculation, and pure invention can actually lend energy to the work, not just for the writer as it's being created, but for the reader as it's being experienced on the page. So here we are now, it's 6 years later. You're on the far side of having written the flight portfolio. Are there any amendments or additions or subtractions to that sort of assessment? And also, do you think that, and this is kind of a leading question, but do you think that historical fiction is expected to play by any different rules from regular fiction?
Well, the great thing about it is that you get to decide. You get to decide what kind of writer you want to be. You can play by the rules that you set. And some people are quite strict about those rules, and some people are less so. I'm super strict about those rules, and I think that the way that I would characterize what I actually ended up doing in The Invisible Bridge and in the flight portfolio is kind of different from the way I characterized it there. You know, The Invisible Bridge was in part about my grandparents' experiences during the Second World War and about my grandfather's service in a forced labor battalion in the Hungarian army. In that book, I felt like I could invent much more fluidly, not invent, but I could make things happen to my protagonist that didn't happen to my grandfather. Like when I came across this incredible archive of handmade newspapers that these guys in forced labor battalions had made, had handwritten or typed on typewriters that they found and secretly used. My grandfather never had anything to do with a newspaper in his forced labor battalion, but I thought, oh my God, these have to be in the novel because they're fantastic. They were satirical in tone. They contained all these incredible details about what happened in forced labor, and I didn't think twice about allowing my protagonist to be an editor and writer of these newspapers. But when it came to Aryan Frey, whose life was so extensively documented, there was not one moment where I thought, oh, you know what, I'm just going to take what's on the page of history and change it. I didn't want to do that at all because I felt like what was quite important to me about telling his story was to let people know who he had actually been and what he had done. What ended up happening that was different from what I said was that I found that the places where I was inventing were places that history couldn't have touched. So in this novel, there is a plausible side story to Aryan Frey's actual story involving a fictional character named Elliot Grant, who was present in that scene that I read to you guys, who Aryan had this very close relationship with in college, who shows up in Marseille trying to help his lover find and save his son, who's lost somewhere in Europe. And he approaches Aryan for help because he knows that Aryan's involved in similar work, and they end up becoming involved again. Now, I knew when I embarked on the book that I wanted there to be some important relationship in Aryan's life that was going to affect the decisions he made. One of the things that was so difficult about the job that he undertook was that he had limited time, limited means, and limited tolerance on the part of both the US and French government. So he couldn't help everyone who applied to him for aid. His organization's mandate was to save only the most talented. And that was his belief too when he embarked on this mission. He thought that that was what he was going to do. He didn't end up doing that exactly. He ended up expanding the mission significantly once he saw how bad things were actually on the ground there in France. But it seemed to me like anything that would complicate that mission would be interesting for me to think about and for a reader to read about. So I thought, well, what if there was somebody there? It just seemed like there had to have been somebody there who he loved, who he felt so deeply about, that his affection for that person might have affected his decisions. This was even before I knew about the extent of his relationship with Stefan Hessel. And I thought, oh, what if there was a relationship that he would not have felt like he could have written about? What if there was somebody whose story could plausibly exist alongside the actual history and who could not have been documented because it wasn't the practice at that time for men to document their same-sex relationships.
As you had said before, it wasn't meant to be an alternate history, it's an adjunct history, it's additive. Right?
That's right. That's right.
There was a moment so I went to Julie's book launch in Brooklyn at Greenlight Books, and there was somebody who asked you the question, what was harder for you? What was the bigger challenge for you, writing across gender, writing across race, writing across sexual orientation? And you actually said, it was none of those things. It was writing for a historical figure.
Yeah.
And that sort of, let me ask you, is there any sort of, do you feel a difference in responsibility? Because obviously with your grandfather, you wanted to be faithful for your family's legacy, for your family's story, but you also had, you asked permission for your grandmother. You would just say, look, in the book, he falls in love with somebody else. It's not you.
Yeah.
But you couldn't exactly do that with Aryan Frey.
I couldn't ask his permission. And I feel like we enter a kind of dangerous territory when authors feel like they have to ask permission to write fiction. When we pick up a book and it says on the cover, a novel, we understand collectively that what we are reading is an invention. We understand that even if it addresses history faithfully, as this book attempts to do, the author is going to have taken some liberty with the act of creation. And we want that. We come to fiction for that. In fact, what we really come to fiction for is the creation of an internal self. I think that the true power of the art, the thing that fiction can do that no other medium can do, is to actually allow us as readers to inhabit the mind of another human being. We're not really allowed to do that as historians. We're allowed to speculate. But as fiction writers, we're allowed to render the mind as fact, the interior of a mind as fact. And that's...
It's also, as you actually pointed out in the speech that you gave at Radcliffe, these aren't even things that we tend to do in our real lives. Like, there's always a separation between you and another person, you and a friend, you and a spouse. It's really hard to go really, really deep past that wall to know somebody.
Yeah.
I mean, what was the great E.M. Forster aspects of the novel that you sort of held tight when you were writing this book? And that this is what fiction can do, is that you can actually go very, very far within the heart and the mind and be able to hear people's thoughts that you can't, no matter how much you know somebody or communicate with somebody, it's hard to get past it's hard for people to know themselves.
Yeah. Well, I mean, can I ask you a question, since we're in conversation? You write and make films, and I think one of the things that seems challenging about that medium is is how you create interiority in a film.
This is why, it's the heartache, because then this is why you go and you see movies like we just saw Ad Astra the other day, the Brad Pitt movie, and you're like, oh yeah, it's 60% of it is voiceover, because sometimes it's the cheat, but it's the way in. The thing that's difficult about screenwriting is that, of course, character has to be revealed, first of all, through action, through what they're actually doing. And then it's the close-up. It's that when you're looking at somebody's face, and if you have a really great performer and they are in control of their instrument, and you can see into their eyes and see that momentary flinching of fear or self-doubt or lust or whatever those things are. If you have a director who can capture, if you have a performer who is in control of themselves, and that's the interiority that you can get. In terms of backstory, this is why we have the flashback, as inelegant as it may seem, and it's why we have the curse of exposition. And you have to have someone saying, oh yeah, I'm so glad that you brought up that I once dropped out of high school because I'm insecure about my intellectuality, So you have to say those things to get interior. But
there is a cool thing that you do that I realized that I also do, which is that I was thinking of your Brooklyn, Maine screenplay, in which there's this character who's had a life that's completely outside of Maine, and that she is given as a present a shipbuilding course. And she comes into this unfamiliar environment, and she meets these people who know nothing about her. And even though she's rather cagey, eventually she ends up talking to others who she meets about her story. And she ends up revealing herself through the act of storytelling. And I realize that we do that too as fiction writers. I realize there are a lot of instances in this book, actually, where characters are... these two characters, Varian and Grant, who were so close when they were in college, they've been separated for 12 years. And so there's a lot of storytelling that goes on about what it was that happened over the course of those 12 years. Well, my God, what happened after? They were really closely involved in college. And then Grant left precipitously once he realized that Varian was courting a woman and was intending to marry her. And so then there's the moment in this book where they turn to each other and they sort of realize that they have to tell each other the stories of what happened after they're split. And there's a lot of characterization, I think, that goes on in fiction through that same kind of storytelling.
And between Grant and Varian, there's also a little bit of nostalgia. For you, there's always that. As puppet master, you're able to make a reference to some inside joke that they have, and then you're able to go and let it be a very elegant exposition of what happened between the two of them, but you can see the sort of sparkle. I love the love story in this book so much. And I also, that's another thing that I wanted to touch upon real quick, because you're so driven towards authenticity and making sure like the verisimilitude is there throughout, whether it's a table setting where the words that, you know, the right era appropriate words that people would use. How did you go about trying to make, or what pains did you take to make the love story between these two men as authentic and real as possible, knowing that there was not going to be any, you know, it was just a big empty space in terms of what you could research about his relationships, maybe even if it was Lincoln Kirstein, there probably wasn't much written about it. How did you?
Well, I had a number of relationships with men.
Okay.
Prior to the writing of this book. So I got to know some men pretty well, both gay and straight. I don't know, well, I read a lot of Ed White, which was a great pleasure. I read a lot of James Baldwin. Grant is also of mixed race, and I read a lot about the phenomenon of racial passing in America. And
Book passing, did you read?
Nella Larson's book,
Nella
yeah,
Larson.
was absolutely incredible and eye-opening. I guess what I realized when I was undertaking that very scary act of writing The Invisible Bridge, which is about my grandfather's experiences, or the character was loosely based on my grandfather and his experiences in 1940s France and Hungary, was that he was a human being, and that there are these common characteristics and common ways of understanding the world that we share, and that though it is impossible for me to actually understand what it would have been like for him, I had the advantage of being able to talk to him, just as I had Varian's voice in my mind through his memoirs and his letters as I was writing this book. And then there were certain things that went on for him that I was experiencing too, or that I had experienced too, and I could extrapolate. But then there was also the very important step with both books of being able to hand the novel over to somebody, hand a draft over to somebody who had lived something that was closer to what the character had lived, and say, where did I get it wrong, you know? And then doing that in time to be able to make the necessary changes.
That probably was a little stressful also.
It was very stressful.
So because of the time, I feel like I'm just going to ask you one more question, and then if we open it up to folks in the audience. I remember, again, in Greenlight Books, you had mentioned a professor of yours in Iowa was telling you about his sort of theory about the difference between a short story and a novel and embarking on it, and that when you're writing a short story, you know what the far shore is going to be. I'm paraphrasing, but that in a novel, you have to wade deep enough into the middle so that you lose sight of either shore, and that you have to sort of be comfortable in a big, vast, uncertain space. And in terms of plotting, because it's such a tight structure to this book, there's so many setups and callbacks and reversals and surprises, and it's very tightly woven. As a screenwriter, of course, I'm imagining like gigantic rooms of whiteboards and outlines in order to sort of piece all those things together. But of course you had, for some reason I'm picturing you like Tarzan, where you're swinging on the vines of invention and landing on a tree of reality, and just sort of having to go.
I love that.
Like picking out place to place where it's like, you know that you have to spend all the story around these events that happened in this one year that you've chosen to write about. But did it all feel like invention, or was there a moment in terms of the plot? I want to know how you interwove the things, because many things happen. You have to still be able to choose what are the things that you're going to portray. But in the beginning of the writing, did you have any idea where you were going to end? No.
Hell no. No, but yeah, at the same time. Well, I mean, the thing was that and this is the cheat of the historical novel, really. If you're going to follow an arc of history, you do know where the story's going to end. I did know that I wanted the story to trace Aryan Frey's time in Marseille. I wanted it to begin soon after he had arrived, and I wanted it to, the main thrust of the narrative, to end soon after he left. And then there were the events that actually took place during his time there, when he met the people who were helping him out, when he extracted certain of his clients. When did the Chagalls leave, for example? When was he able to get Max Ernst out? When did André Breton and his wife leave? How did he get their visas? All of those things that I could learn from the history, they were the sort of skeleton of the novel, in a way.
Trees. Stick to my metaphor, thank you.
They were the trees. And I swung on the vines.
Thank you. My life is complete.
Of the story between Varian and Grant that I invented. And the real fun of it was to figure out the places where the trees and the vines became one, where the vines wrapped around the trees and became symbiotic and inextricable. And the process, although I love your idea of just this room with storyboarding and all that, I mean, I don't have a desk. I literally don't have a desk. After my daughter was born, I came to the realization that I was going to have to get rid of my desk that I had loved for years, because there was no longer any room for it in my house unless I actually literally put it on my bed, which I hear is a bad idea. So my desk left my house. I cried as I, turned it over to the person who bought it on Craigslist.
You did comment on my desk in my house today, very longingly.
Yeah, but I have something that's better than my own desk. I belong to the Brooklyn Writers Space, where I can go at any time of day or night, and I do. And there's this marvelous silent room where you have these carols where you can work for as long as you want to. And then there's a common space where we hang out and have lunch, and then there's some outdoor space. But basically what that means is that you go and you have to set up and break down every time you're there. So anything that I wrote down, all of my diagramming, anything like that went on in notebooks that I could take with me. And I had a tiny little locker there that's about the size of I could fit maybe 4 books in there and a few notebooks and a mug from Blue Hill, Maine that I would have my tea in every day. And so those charts and images, I had a number of images of the artists and writers who he saved. And I would put those up in my carrel, and then I would take them down at the end of the day, the particular people I would be writing about that day. And there was something about that caused the architecture of the book to have to reside in my mind and not in an external space, which actually was quite nice, because that meant that as I was picking up my daughter from nursery school, or taking my son to piano, or helping my husband, with the dishes at the end of the day, or do whatever it was that I actually needed to do, I could be working at the same time, and I really did. I was never really not working on the book all those years that I was working on the book.
Maybe a decade?
It was actually, it was almost a decade. There were so many hours in the middle of the night where I was taking care of a child who needed to nurse or be soothed or whatever it was, where I was I was taking care of my book in a way at the same time. And I don't know the effect that might have had upon my children, but at least it produced a book that has helped to take care of them too.
But that's the whole point of loving what you do, is that you actually want to think about it when you're not at work.
That was true.
Right?
That was true. And in fact, the really scary thing about this was, and we've talked about this before, that eventually, it took me so damn long to write this book, that the kid who was a fetus in my belly when I first went to Marseille to research it, by the time I was actually writing the final draft, was talking to me about the problems of the novel as we were walking to pick up his sister from school. So,
All right, well, thank you for taking my questions. I would love to open it up. I would love to open it up to questions, and it can be about this book, it can be about writing, it can be about Julie's Carol, anything you want. We are game. Young man in the red tie.
when you're writing historical fiction, how do you avoid the trap of anachronism, not just with language, but also with attitudes that have changed so much in the last 80 years? Or at some point, do you give yourself permission to have something that's a little anachronistic so that people who are your readers now can identify with it?
Well, that's such a good question, because I guess one of the things one wonders about as a writer is how we really know what things were like at that time. I mean, not having lived at that time, we have documents like books and movies, but books and movies are performances in a way. They don't exactly represent the way people spoke or the way people dressed or looked or interacted. They're stylized versions of that. I found much more accurate representations of what the time might have been like through the non-published writings, through the letters that I read, and through the notes Varian made, and then also through interviews I watched with his associates who were still living, or who had died shortly before but had lived long enough for there to be video recorded of their recollections. And then I had to simply not worry about that too much. I had to simply try to do my best to capture what it might have been like without resorting to a kind of oversimplification of what somebody was supposed to sound like in the 40s or how somebody was supposed to behave. At the same time, I feel like there was also, I took some liberties simply because I think that the attitudes that were able to be expressed publicly did not represent the full complexity of people's feelings at the time. And so I took some greater liberties with private feelings and private thoughts, and perhaps brought some of them maybe optimistically in line, closer in line with some of our more publicly expressed mores that exist now. And I think that the test of anachronism, the true test of anachronism, is to be able to give the book to somebody who has lived the time, and who can comment upon it. When I did that with The Invisible Bridge, one of my first readers was my grandmother, who's now 97 years old, and who could call out details that were as specific as the color of a woman's kerchief and say things like, a woman of that age would have been wearing a dark blue kerchief and not a red one. I think that there's really no substitute for actually vetting with somebody who was around then. But I also think that an over-obsession with whether something is correct or not can be such a barrier to the work that it can never get written. So I tried not to live in fear about that stuff. I tried to just to have Varian's voice in my mind, the voice that I read in his letters and his papers, and sort of allow that to be my guide.
Dad?
Thanks. Hi, Julie.
Hi, Dad.
My name is Roy. I'm Desi's dad. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Roy.
I have a question that's kind of related to Desi's bizarre and wonderful Tarzan swinging along process question. And it has to do with the rhythms that you're going through when you're writing. In the case of the flight portfolio, you have this inexorable momentum. You have events that have to come in order. You know that there's this darkening shadow of Nazism over everyone and everything, and it creates this compelling narrative, and it's gripping and all those wonderful things. I loved it. Simultaneously with that inexorable drive of the narrative, you have all these incredible vignettes where things came together. It could be where the protagonists are sailing out near the railroad trestle in Marseille Harbor. It could be climbing the steeps of the Pyrenees to find the escape route. It could be that incredible scene with the cyclists, the two of them cycling in the tremendous thunderstorm. I mean, there's so many scenes that are just memorable and beautiful and described with just infinite detail, as if, I mean, I felt like I was there with them. It wasn't reading, it was experiencing. It was living what you created. And I was convinced, I know we have to suspend disbelief and all that, in whether it be in Desi and Sean's movies or in your novels, but I wanted it to be real. I knew those were real artists. I've admired their work. I was so proud to know that there were people like Aryan Frey who actually did this. Well, my question is, here you took so many years to write this, and I think it shows when you read it in the detail. It's magnificent. But what worries me is that the compelling narrative probably was, even though it was painstaking and it took you a lot of research, it was years, but how many more years just making sure that every detail, maybe a lot of your readers won't notice all of that, but the details of the escargot they found down in the valley near Bel Air or whatever it was, every leaf, every angle of the sun, there were just so many things that convinced me it was real. So you have these moments that are going on, and each one of them must have taken you so long to craft. And yet this means that over the course of your writing lifetime, and may it last a century, there's time for a great book, or two, or three, or five, but perhaps there will be less time because you're such a perfectionist. The comparison, I'm sorry for this long question, but I'm thinking of the difference between, let's say, a trompe l'oeil, make everything perfect kind of artist, and something. You're not a pointillist, and you're not giving us a digital record of it, but you're taking so much time to make it all feel and sound so realistic. Is that taking you away from the narrative, which is more of a, wham, bam, it's all these, almost like Carrie with a wall of clues trying to solve this in Homeland.
Yeah.
How do you coordinate? That's the question. I'm sorry for going on.
No, this is one of the greatest craft questions I think I've ever been asked in my life, or even heard asked. And I'm thinking of the craft questions that I've asked. Really, this is the question that I'm bringing straight to my NYU class on Tuesday. I'm teaching this class about setting and novels and short stories. And this is exactly the question that I want my students to be considering. How do you find some balance between actually creating a habitable universe, one that really feels like the characters are living in and one that the reader can live in, and propelling the book forward? And the other part of your question that I think is really important and that I really do dwell upon, that keeps me up at night, is if it's important to me to create a world that I feel like we can live in and that the characters can live in, does it have to take 7 years to do, I have babies to take care of, I need to, I don't want to take 7 years to write every single book all my life. In answer to the first part of the question, in a weird way, it's so much easier for me to craft, to write place and to write an inhabited scene than it is to write those pillars of the plot, as it were. I think that there's just a deep pleasure that I feel in actually making a place similar to the pleasure that I feel that Sean, Desi's husband, took in creating an incredible treehouse in Maine over the last 2 summers. Just making sure that everything worked and that all hung together in all of its kind of intricacy. But But the tree has to be there too. You know, you have to have that part too. So I think that that in terms of the time that it took to do it, it took me so much more time to piece together the actual events than to write the scenes where so many things were observed, you know? But the other part of the question, does it need to take 7 years to write every single goddamn book? Not everyone I know takes 7 years to write a novel. And one of the things that I'm hoping will happen with the next book, which is set in the 80s, a time that I actually lived in New Orleans, a town that I actually lived in, is that perhaps I won't need to spend 4 years researching the book before I feel like I can commit words to paper. I also plan to give birth fewer times during the trajectory of the writing of the next book. The number of times may actually be 0, because having 2 children is terrific. And so I think that that it's conceivable that it might take less time to write the next book. But it's, you know, I think the reason that it's actually important to consider the amount of time it takes is because I think that maybe I'm going to say something that is, well, I guess what I'm going to say is that fiction is important right now. Art is important right now. This is a moment where we actually need the things that have to be said to get said. And so maybe there are times, politically speaking, where it is more advisable to take one's time, and maybe there are other times when one needs to simply get the stories told. So I'm going to take your question to heart and consider it as I'm moving into this next project.
Thank you. May there be many more.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. I'm sorry we gotta, because I wanted to first thank Longfellow Books for being here and being here a little later than usual. And thank you all for being such a great audience. And please ask your question to her in the line while you buy a book. Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Desi.